We'd like you to listen to tenants in some of Boston's 57 public housing projects describe the conditions they're forced to live with.
The worst problems that I have to live with is roaches, rats, the trash outside. We don't have windows in the hallways. The incinerators get blocked up. The smoke comes out. If you come out your door, you might choke to death. There are people with all types of sick babies out here because of the water and the trash out here. There's so many problems you couldn't begin to just speak on them.
My living room window is not tightly, put in, and it's like a draft. It's like no window is there when the window's up in the corner of my apartment. And the heating system there, in the mornings it's very cold when I get my son up in the morning from nursery school. At night the heat goes down, and he's, I can't make sure that he's covered, and he's already had 8 episodes of pneumonia.
Cellars that are really dirty, kids go down them and they're a health hazard. There are apartments that have never been fixed. I have a man that's lived in an apartment for 19 years and never had it painted yet. They got lousy bathrooms. Half the showers don't work. The walls are caving in.
Conditions didn't get this way overnight. For years, public housing has been a neglected stepchild of the state and federal governments, which own and fund it. And few politicians have gone to bat for public housing tenants. That's largely because they're among the poorest families in Boston, and they tend not to vote. But tenants have finally succeeded in forcing accountability from the local agency which manages public housing, the Boston Housing Authority. We'll provide details in our next editorial.
Yeah. Now check this out. Now what we have here is the Yes You May remix, right? But Percy P and my man AG ain't here, and I got my man Big L in the house, you know what I'm saying? And we swinging shit for 92. Check it out, yo. Hey yo, everywhere that I go, brothers know my fucking name. I'm Florida niggas and I only weigh a buck and change. I gave a lot of black guys in my extorting days fucking with me. A lot of niggas with sports shades. I grabbed the microphone and started jerks. Niggas running up, put me on. What the fuck is the Star Search? I'm relieving rappers like Sudafed. And if the microphone was smoke, then Big L would be a Buddha head. Hey yo, I cruise real smooth like mopeds. I was rocking mics since niggas was wearing broke kids. I only roll with originators. Chicks stick to my dick like magnets on refrigerators. I'm a crazy mean lyricist. Many are in fear of this. Yeah, so they stay clear of this. And those that refuse to order Big L bruise and slaughter. Niggas hear me and take notes like a news reporter. I'll bend a rapper like a fender. I'm slender, but far from tender. Killing niggas like a clan member. You can't touch this. Your rhymes are too darn weak front. And I'ma introduce your brains to the concrete. I keep hoes satisfied. I'm pushing the baddest ride to take me out, true. Even the baddest tried, but they failed cause my technique's saliva. I'm so deaf I need a hearing aid with an equalizer. You tried to hit a home run, but you struck out. My rhymes were released. I like to say peace the fuck out.
We've been editorializing on the horrid conditions that exist in much of Boston's public housing. Since nearly 10% of the city's population lives in public housing, the problems are hard to ignore. For years, politicians have visited the projects and observed the steady deterioration of conditions. Promises were made, but soon forgotten.
Back in 74, I'm sorry, Louise Day Hicks came out here, and Mayor White came out here, and Louise held meetings at our management office promising the people that if they came to her, whatever they wished to be done in their apartments would be done. Well, everybody came out to see Louise, but in fact nothing did get done. And then we held a D Street date, and Mayor White came out here, and he got on the stand, and he promised the people that D Street would become the garden spot of South Boston, referring to Old Harbor Village, which is the garden spot of South Boston. Again, another commitment, but nothing had ever been done.
If politicians have a short memory when it comes to public housing, there's a simple explanation for it. Public housing tenants are poor, and they tend not to vote. Secondly, because the Boston Housing Authority is, by law, an independent agency, City Hall can disclaim responsibility for its failures. Yet it's common knowledge that Mayor Kevin White wields substantial control of the BHA through his power to appoint most of the members of its governing board. Moreover, Mayor White has allegedly used the BHA as a dumping ground for political patronage. It's believed that this practice has had a pernicious effect on the management of public housing. It should be stopped. The mayor, along with other political leaders, must be held to their promises to make public housing decent. Miserable conditions at much of Boston's public housing are the result of gross underfunding by the state and federal governments, as well as of severe mismanagement by the Boston Housing Authority. However, the destructive role of tenants themselves can't be overlooked. This apartment at South Boston's D Street project was a recent victim of vandalism. Walls, floors, woodwork, most everything was wrecked in a wild rampage. Whatever wasn't destroyed, the Boston Housing Authority has had to dismantle in order to rehabilitate the apartment and make it rentable again. Malicious damage like this is a familiar sight in public housing, and it's often caused by tenants, generally adolescents. And the trashing of apartments is not their only pastime. They climb onto roofs and remove copper flashing, which is needed to protect against water leaks. They stuff large objects down pipes in the roof, which controls sewage flow, causing severe, foul-smelling sewage backups right in people's apartments. And due to vandalism of pipes and cellars, many tenants are deprived of heat and hot water. Overall, vandalism throughout public housing costs hundreds of thousands of dollars in damage each year. Surely it's only a small percentage of tenants who cause such destruction. The Boston Housing Authority could prevent much of it by boarding up vacant apartments as soon as tenants move out, and by securing all entrances to cellars and roofs. But vandals have been known to break through doors welded shut. Ultimately, it's up to tenants to educate their children and to report acts of vandalism they witness. If tenants don't care, no one will. In our last editorial, we talked about how the deterioration of Boston's public housing is hastened by a small percentage of tenants who vandalize property. But there are less flagrant ways in which tenants contribute to their own victimization. One way is by not paying their rent. The Boston Housing Authority fails to collect about $600,000 yearly in rental income, money which is needed to pay for the upkeep of housing. We also found that too many tenants are dependent on the Boston Housing Authority to perform maintenance and repairs that with little expense and trouble tenants could do themselves. For example, one tenant we talked to at South Boston's D Street project complained of poor heating due to dirty radiators and blamed the BHA. But we observed that radiator covers can be easily unscrewed and dirt removed by tenants themselves with a vacuum cleaner or a damp sponge. Overall, a main problem is that public housing has increasingly become the last resort for families which other landlords in the city refuse to house. Responsible tenants resent this.
Should be made aware of the fact that public housing is not just for people who are down and out. Public housing should be for, and it is, for anyone who wants to live there. I think in a number of cases, tenants feel as though they're doing housing a favor by moving there.
The Boston Housing Authority owes it to the many good tenants in public housing to do a better job in screening out undesirables. The number of families on the BHA's waiting list is far greater than the number of available apartments. We believe that people are entitled to decent housing, regardless of their economic status. But irresponsible and abusive tenants forfeit that right. One of the biggest problems facing public housing in Boston is shifting racial balance. For example, in 1970 at Brighton's Commonwealth development, 65 tenants, or about 1/10 of the project, were non-white. In 7 years, the number of non-whites has quadrupled. One of the tenants we talked to at Columbia Point in Dorchester explained how a pattern of racial segregation can systematically destroy a project.
When I first moved here, there was mostly white and black. The place was pretty well kept up. As the white families moved out, the place was deteriorating. The place started going down. There was less protection. They stopped giving any help as far as plumbing, extermination, any type of help that you needed for repairs. You just weren't able to get them. This is what always happens in ghetto areas with blacks and Spanish-speaking. They let the place go down.
This is also what tenants at Rosendale's Archdale project fear. Here, as at several other projects, white flight is beginning. To avoid isolation from the surrounding white community, Archdale is desperately trying to attract white tenants for 45 now vacant apartments. But as conditions deteriorate further, this gets harder and harder. The Boston Housing Authority is now under court order to promote racial balance at Archdale, Commonwealth, and a few other projects where it's practical. We fully support these efforts. At the same time, we believe that any attempt to reintegrate projects where segregation is firmly established could only be destructive. Despite horrid conditions in many of Boston's public housing projects, some tenants remain optimistic. That's because of a court order signed by the Boston Housing Authority this past May, which requires the BHA to reform almost every aspect of its sadly managed operations. Failure to comply could land the authority in receivership next year. The court order is actually a 260-page consent decree. It was negotiated by the authority and by lawyers representing public housing tenants who sued the BHA in the Boston Housing Court. The decree recognizes that the miserable conditions in public housing are largely a function of the authority's poor management and not only the product of inadequate funding. In fact, the court found that substantial funds were available for housing repair that the BHA delayed in spending or failed to spend entirely. Altogether, the consent decree prescribes over 150 actions that the authority must take in 13 main areas. One of these areas is maintenance. Currently, work orders get strangled by red tape, and tenants may wait months for repairs. The decree also calls for better budgeting, more control for project managers, the prompt use of government funds, speedy rental of apartments, and practices which foster racial integration in some projects. Perhaps most importantly, the court now has veto power over all new personnel appointments. We fully support the terms of the consent decree. Non-compliance by the BHA would make court receivership justified and probably inevitable. This is Columbia Point. Built 24 years ago with more than 1,300 units, it's now 60% vacant. Columbia Point needs a new boiler plant, a new electrical system, new roofing on all occupied buildings, and substantial interior repairs, including new windows, new kitchen sinks, and new showers. The irony is that the Boston Housing Authority has had $8 million to fix up Columbia Point since 1975. Plans for the use of that money have only recently been completed, and even today little work has been done. Failure to spend state and federal modernization funds is a cruel result of BHA's mismanagement, and it's not just limited to Columbia Point. As of March 1976, the BHA had spent only half of the $39 million in federal modernization funds received for all projects since 1969. In that same period, unspent state funds totaled $1.2 million. These were some of the findings of the Boston Housing Court, where a suit was filed against the BHA 2 years ago. The court traced the problem of unspent funds to a simple staffing shortage in the authority's modernization program. The BHA has begun to correct this problem, but millions of dollars have already been lost through inflation. And who can begin to measure the hardship and sickness imposed upon tenants due to leaky roofs, backed up plumbing, dangerous electrical wiring, drafty windows, sporadic hot water, and the threat of crime due to unsecured doors and windows? The list of problems goes on. The BHA pins most of the blame on lack of funds. We say, let it use promptly and wisely the money it has. In our editorials over the last few weeks, we've talked about miserable conditions that exist in much of Boston's public housing, ranging from leaky roofs and drafty windows to sewage backups, power failures, and rat infestation. But many tenants feel that their worst problem is crime and the fear of it. This chart shows the total number of crimes reported in 1976 at some of Boston's housing projects. It's believed that actual crime in public housing far exceeds reported crime, and that much of it is caused by people who live elsewhere. A major problem is that police protection is inadequate. Although public housing is home for nearly 10% of the city's population, only about 2% of the Boston police force is specifically assigned to the projects. Many tenants feel like virtual prisoners in their apartments, particularly at night. Even there, they may not be safe. Recently, at the Dorchester project, 2 women were raped after the assailants entered their apartments through ground floor windows. In most projects, windows lack protective screens like these to prevent easy access from outside. Few projects have exterior security doors like this. Some buildings have no doors. Many tenants who live in apartments where windows may be entered from the roof or the ground have resorted to nailing their windows shut and covering them with chicken wire. We heard of one tenant who blocks off her windows with thick plywood boards. No one should have to live this way. Public housing tenants have as much right to safe housing as anyone in this city. Police protection must be stepped up, and the Boston Housing Authority must make apartments secure. It's become such a familiar story that it rarely makes headlines anymore, but conditions at many of Boston's 57 public housing projects are nothing less than scandalous. The state and federal governments which own the projects are acknowledged slumlords. The Boston Housing Authority, which manages them, has bungled miserably almost every aspect of its operations, and a large percentage of the city's 17,000 units, perhaps the majority, violate the state sanitary code. In other words, they're not fit to live in. Probably the city's worst public housing project is Columbia Point. Built 24 years ago with more than 1,300 units, the project has dwindled to an occupancy of about 480. And there's a joke at Columbia Point that the rats and roaches now outnumber the tenants. Other problems include roofs and walls that leak when it rains, windows that get stuck, open or closed, apartments that go without hot water for months. Add to this the constant threat of electrical fire. Then, on top of these horrible conditions, there's the problem of crime. About 30 serious crimes are reported at Columbia Point each month. Yet only one police cruiser is assigned to the project, and security doors and windows, which tenants have been demanding for years, have still not been installed. On the other hand, horrid conditions like these cloud the fact that some of the city's projects are quite livable, and many more could be. That goes for the majority of elderly projects and for family developments like Gallivan Boulevard in Mattapan. Gallivan Boulevard is a nice residential community, a fine place to raise children, and tenants take pride in keeping it that way. But even Gallivan Boulevard has its problems, stemming from the fact that it is 25 years old. Antiquated plumbing and electrical systems should be replaced. Kitchens and bathrooms should be remodeled, and tenants are concerned that without proper maintenance, Gallivan Boulevard could decline dramatically in the next few years. The concern is even greater at Roslindale's Archdale development. Here, there are no glaring violations of the state sanitary code, but the overall appearance of Archdale is grim. Inside, windows are drafty and woodwork corroded, and as crime and vandalism accelerate, so does the exodus of tenants, particularly white tenants. So the problem is not just the 3 or 4 projects which have decayed to the depths of Columbia Point. It's the many projects, decent ones too, which could also decline in a few years. Public housing, where nearly 10% of Boston's people live, is a classic case of government penalizing the poor. No one should have to live in conditions which jeopardize health and safety. And the anxiety that comes with fear of crime and lack of security must also be relieved. The longer we wait to face up to this, the more costly the remedies will be. Public housing is a time bomb we can't afford to ignore. Public housing in Boston is a textbook example of how government cruelly turns its back on poor people. The state and federal governments which own public housing and the local agency which manages it have dodged responsibility for the horrid conditions in which 1/10 of Boston's population must live. The federal government, through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, funds 45 of the city's 57 projects. The other 12 are funded through the State Department of Community Affairs. Funds are paid to the Boston Housing Authority, which manages the projects. Historically, the Boston Housing Authority has begged off responsibility for conditions like these, claiming that grossly inadequate funding does not allow for the delivery of needed services. The state and federal governments have countered with the charge that the BHA has either failed to spend or has misused much of the funds it has received. The fact of the matter is, both charges are true. For years, tenants have been trying to get their case heard in state and federal courts. Finally, Judge Paul Garrity of the Boston Housing Court took on the tenants' cause. Judge Garrity found that much of Boston's public housing violated state sanitary codes. His original ruling, before it was reversed in a higher court, would have required the state to provide funds to correct these violations. Now the Boston Housing Authority is the sole defendant. This was an unfortunate turnabout, because without more funds, public housing can't survive. But the Garrity decision has, if nothing else, put a spotlight on the problems. In our next editorial, we'll look at some of the solutions. This is our second week of editorials on the horrid conditions that exist in many of Boston's 57 public housing projects. But some tenants can remember when things were different.
14 years ago, Columbia Point had benches outside of each building. We had trees. The hallways were beautiful, they were clean, because the management, he went door to door every day. He was going through building to building, and whatever hallways weren't clean, he knocked on the tenant's door, and that hallway was clean by the time he got out the building.
In those days, the project manager was the backbone of public housing. Not only did he have a strong voice in tenant selection, he also had a maintenance staff under his control. But in recent years, the BHA has systematically centralized authority, removing it from a project manager's hands. To many tenants, this signaled the decline of public housing.
When the leadership for management of BHA went down, the leadership of the tenants went down also.
At one time, we had a maintenance office right here. If we wanted a plumber, we'd go to the office and a plumber would come out, a carpenter, a glazier, or whatever. Now you have to call into Central, and they give you a work order number, and you sit tight and wait. If you're lucky, you might get it in 2 or 3 days. Now, it was an instance where in one development, all the plumbing was ripped out by the kids, and we didn't have a plumber for 3 weeks.
The Boston Housing Authority is now under court order to reorganize its maintenance operations. But the human suffering and much of the damage already inflicted can't be reversed. Conditions in Boston's public housing projects have decayed so badly that at least $50 million is needed to make a substantial difference. But it's the day-to-day problems, the stopped-up sinks, the broken windows, and the flooded bathrooms that can really make life bleak. Tenants may wait months for a simple repair job, and many never get done. One reason is that maintenance work for the Boston Housing Authority is subject by union contract to a rigid set of work rules. So it can take more workmen to perform a simple maintenance task for the BHA than it takes doctors to perform major surgery. For example, the repair of a broken window might require the services of a carpenter to fix the frame, a glazier to replace the glass, and a painter to paint the frame. Moreover, union contracts stipulate that work be performed by skilled, highly paid craftsmen. This means that the Boston Housing Authority must pay a plumber $9 an hour to unstop a toilet and an electrician almost $10 an hour to replace a light switch plate. An estimated 80% of all maintenance is of this unskilled or semi-skilled nature. Obviously, these simple tasks should be performed by handymen, not highly paid craftsmen. But organized labor has fought any change. We think the Boston Housing Authority should fight back and create a handyman category. Public housing probably generates 100,000 maintenance orders a year. Craftsmen should be reserved for jobs where their skills are needed and their high salaries warranted. We've been editorializing about a suit brought against the Boston Housing Authority on behalf of public housing tenants and the recent signing of a consent decree in the Boston Housing Court. The consent decree calls for a major overhaul of the authority's mismanaged operations. The reforms are desperately needed, but the decree has drawbacks. Court-related costs for the next 3 years will total almost $500,000. The BHA must pay this high cost and also pay for its own legal counsel with funds that should be used to improve public housing. This wouldn't matter if the consent decree could guarantee substantial housing improvements, but it can't. The consent decree is a great management tool for the Boston Housing Authority, but it's powerless in dealing with the foremost cause of poor housing conditions, scarce funds. State and federal courts have consistently ruled that government is not obliged to provide money for public housing repairs. Yet we don't believe that government can continue to walk away from public housing. Think of it this way. A private landlord could not get away with forcing even one tenant to live with rats, leaky roofs, hazardous electrical wiring, and ceilings so corroded that paint falls into food when tenants cook or eat. But government allows these conditions in public housing, which is home for thousands of people. The government may not have a legal obligation to correct horrid public housing conditions, but it does have a moral one. Conditions like these at South Boston's D Street project have become a symbol of public housing's failure. Nevertheless, much of public housing is quite decent, and this fact is too often overlooked. For example, this is Gallivant Boulevard, known as the Wellesley Hills of public housing. The cruel irony is that tenants are in effect penalized for keeping it that way. When funds for modernization become available, they tend to go to the most desperate projects. In the meantime, Galavan Boulevard badly needs new plumbing and a new electrical system. Overall, tenants fear decaying conditions.
The buildings are going to go down. The people are going to get very disgusted because of no maintenance being done here. That Galavan Boulevard will eventually be a D Street.
The problems at Galavan Boulevard raise a crucial question. Should the Boston Housing Authority keep pumping scarce funds into the city's worst projects while the decent ones go downhill? We think that government has an obligation to fix up all public housing, but the $50 million or more that's needed is not likely to be provided. Therefore, the BHA is going to have to set certain priorities. First, we think that tenant self-help efforts at projects like Galavan Boulevard should be rewarded when funding decisions are made. Second, it must be recognized that in many of the worst projects, tenants have a multitude of social problems that money alone can't solve. The only hope may be to attract mixed-income families who will maintain decent conditions. Some tough planning decisions lie ahead, and the BHA avoids this task at great peril. It's a tragic irony that public housing, once a means of clearing slums, has itself become unfit to live in. Severe violations of the state's sanitary code are widespread in public housing, and they're multiplying every day. In this editorial series, we've called for a number of remedies. First, the Boston Housing Authority must swiftly implement court orders to reform the BHA's mismanaged operations. Second, the state and federal governments must provide funds to eliminate unhealthy conditions in public housing and to stop its steady deterioration. Third, we need a national policy that recognizes the tremendous demand for low-income housing, and funding must be increased for alternatives to public housing projects, such as direct rent subsidies for housing in the private market. These three remedies are crucial, but we've pinpointed 5 other steps that are also important. 1, the Boston Housing Authority should create a handyman job category so that routine maintenance need not be performed by highly paid craftsmen. 2, the BHA must plan more carefully the use of its scarce financial resources. Self-help efforts by tenants should be rewarded when funding decisions are made. 3, the BHA must try harder to keep destructive tenants out of housing projects. But tenants themselves must also take responsibility for halting vandalism and for the overall upkeep of housing. 4, the BHA should adopt tenant selection practices which encourage racial balance in those projects where it's practical. 5, police protection in public housing must be increased, and the BHA must make apartments secure. Public housing is a symbol of government's failure to meet the needs of poor people. Overcoming that failure will require all the steps we've talked about today, and perhaps more. We hope that our 6 weeks of editorials on public housing will help somewhat in getting the job done.